Where There's a Will, There's a Way, uncovering the life of Quash, a Black man in 18th century Lincoln County. As I mentioned before, please go ahead and make sure you're on mute for this portion of the talk. Love to have your videos on or off based on whatever you're comfortable with. We're just glad that you're here. I'm Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of the Lincoln County Historical Association, and I'm so pleased that LCHA is bringing you this program this evening. Our presenter, James Tanzer, is actually our own trustee. He's also a skilled researcher working to bring Maine's Black history to light. And it's just such a joy to have him on our board and here talking with us all tonight. James grew up on the North Shore of Boston, where his love of local history began with a high school job at the Wenham Museum in Wenham, Massachusetts. And he went on to obtain a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in medieval history from the University of Toronto, where he was also a PhD student. So he comes by his research that he shares with us tonight with a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge and professionalism. He has been the outreach coordinator at the Puri Macmillan Arctic Museum at Bowdoin College in Brunswick for the last 13 years. And as I said, we're so proud now to have him as a trustee at LCHA. And this summer, if you're lucky, you may be able to find him giving tours at the Pownelborough Courthouse in Dresden. And we're very happy that he is going to be training as a docent for us as well. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to James. I guess before I turn it over to James, I want to remind everyone that we are being recorded. And the other thing I want to remind everyone is that we're happy to take your questions. If you want to put your questions right in the chat to me, there will be a portion for Q&A at the end of the talk. And if you convey those questions through the chat, I'll share them with James at that time. Okay, I'll stop talking. James, it's all you. Thank you for being here. We're very happy to have you. And if we're in person, we'd all clap now.
Thank you. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everyone. On the screen that you see in front of you, the red image where it says, "Where there's a will, there's a way." At the very bottom of that image is my email. So if you want to jot it down and you think of a question tonight, next week, next year, you can email me and I'll do my best to answer it. So again, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me here today. Before I begin the program, I want to acknowledge that Topsham, Maine, the place that I'll be speaking about today, is the traditional land of the Wabanaki, who are the people of the Dawn Land, and they've been its stewards for many, many generations. And I encourage all of you listening tonight to become curious about the Indigenous history of the land you inhabit. There is so much to learn. So thank you, Lincoln County Historical Association, for inviting me here to share my research into the life of Quash, a Black man who lived in Topsham, Maine more than 230 years ago. At that time, when Quash lived in Topsham, Topsham was part of Lincoln County. When I began this journey to understand Quash's life, the pandemic was in its early months. I conducted much of my research online using digitized sources. Despite this limitation, I've been able to trace Quash through a variety of different sources from the 1760s through the 1780s, proving that the hidden lives of Black residents of Maine in the 18th century can indeed be uncovered, even during a pandemic. The sources are there for the finding, although they take a great deal of work to find. Now, this is a research project very much in progress, and you'll hear me say perhaps a lot today. I hope to substantiate my perhapses as my research progresses, but I'm presenting what I've come to know of Quash's story today, as imperfect as my understanding is, because Quash deserves to be seen and remembered, and he deserves to be recognized as part of the Topsham and Brunswick communities in which he lived and died. He deserves to be unhidden. So let's get started with a story of how things might have been. March 3rd, 1786 was a raw, wet, late winter day in Lincoln County, Maine, not a day for venturing far from one's house. It rained all day. Hallowell midwife Martha Ballard wrote in her now famous diary, "I have been at home." 25 or so miles south of her, just down the Kennebec River in the town of Topsham, a man named Quash was readying to make his way out of the world. Perhaps Quash had a feeling this sickness would be his last. Lying in his bed, perhaps he started thinking about Samuel Winchell, the man who had enslaved him, how Winchell had died suddenly 3 years before without having written a will, and how his life's possessions had been divvied up by the court. Quash wasn't about to let that happen to the possessions he'd worked so hard to amass in the time he'd been free. He would do with them what he, and only he, chose to do. His neighbor, Samuel Staple, had been sent to fetch the physician, Philip Hoyt, and when they arrived at his bedside, their woolen coats dripping with rain, Quash told them he was ready to make his will. When it was finished, Quash took up the pen in his weakened hand and made his mark on the paper, a broken but broad X. Then he lay back in bed. It was done, this final act of a free man. Perhaps he was relieved and thought he might rest peacefully at last. Although Quash had already lived many years before his will was written in 1786, it's through his will that I got my very first glimpse of him. I'd been researching a family in Wiscasset and clicking through the digitized index of Lincoln County, Maine probate records. These records are available at familysearch.org, which is a free digitized collection of hundreds of thousands of microfilm records compiled by the LDS Church. Searching the index of the probate records, Quash's name caught my eye. I had recently read the book Black Yankees by William Pearson and had learned about enslaved people's names in 18th century New England. Often names were imposed on them by their enslavers, but sometimes enslaved people retained their birth names. And in the Akan family of languages from the Gold Coast of Africa, Kwasi or Kwesi is a name given to a boy born on a Sunday. And Quash or Quashi was the attempted transliteration of this name into English. I wondered if I was looking at an entry referencing the will of a formerly enslaved person in Maine. When I looked up the will in the digitized probate record book, I was amazed, and I'm going to read to you the will that I found there, which is the closest thing we have to Quash's own words. And you can read along with me. In the name of God, amen. I, Quash Winchell of Topsham, in the county of Lincoln, laborer, being sick and weak in bodily health, but perfect in mind and memory. Thanks be to God for the same. Calling to mind the uncertainty of life and the certainty of death, do make and ordain this, my last will and testament, recommending my soul unto the hands of God who gave it, and my body to the earth to be decently buried, according to the discretion of my executor, whom I shall hereafter appoint. And as to what of this world's goods it has pleased God to bless me with, I dispose of in the following manner. Imprimis, I give and bequeath to my benevolent friends, Silence Purrington, Sarah Hunter, Mary Given, Anne Winchell, and Hannah Winchell, all and singular the goods and chattels to me in any manner belonging, being at present 1 horse and tackling, 2 cows, and 1 3-year-old heifer with 20 sheep, allowing the said Hannah 1/3 more than either of the others, and then an equal division among them, with a certain number of notes of hand, some payable in my name, and some in my late master's Samuel Winchell's, deceased, being given to me when I was a slave, and so wrote in his name. Furthermore, I appoint Mr. Arthur Hunter to be my sole and lawful executor of this, my last will and testament, in witness whereof I've hereunto put my hand and seal the 3rd day of March, AD 1786. Quash Winchell. His mark, which is an X, and there was a seal as well. Quash's will is a treasure trove of information about him and his relationship to the family that enslaved him in Topsham, the Winchells. And as far as I can tell, it's the only surviving will of a formerly enslaved Black Mainer that specifically references their enslavement. Once I knew the name of Quash's enslaver, Samuel Winchell, and the place he lived, Topsham, I thought it would be easy enough to search the internet to find out more about Quash. I was wrong. There was ample information from many different sources on the Winchells, but only 2 references to Quash. One tantalizing clue in the Wheelers' history of Brunswick, Topsham, and Harpswell hinted that more information was available. And this is an excerpt from that book. Here's a reference to a census made in 1765 of the inhabitants of Topsham. Out of a population of 307, exclusive of Native Americans, there is, quote, 1 Negro. This single mention of a Black person in Topsham in 1765 convinced me that there was more about Quash to uncover in the 18th century records, and I decided it was time to learn more about Topsham and the Winchells, to follow this family through time and hopefully find Quash there. In 1711 in Windsor, Connecticut, and made his way to Maine by the 1730s. He settled in Merricanig Neck, just south of Brunswick town, and that's in the right-hand map. This place is now part of Harpswell. Around 1738, he married Sarah McNess, and in 1740, their son John was born. 5 more children quickly followed: Martha, Silence, Samuel, James, and Ebenezer. A year that changed his fortunes for the next several decades of his life. He purchased land in the village of Topsham, over the Androscoggin River from Brunswick, and the rights to a sawmill on the Cathants River there. Now, lumber was perhaps the most profitable resource in the District of Maine in the 18th century. Winchell's stake in the sawmill and the profits from the large quantities of lumber it produced eventually made him one of the wealthiest men in Topsham. You can see Samuel Winchell's name on the house lot there. It's about in the middle of the map. And the Cathants sawmill is circled. In Topsham, the Winchell family continued to grow with the births of Sarah, Mary, Anne, and Hannah. And if several of those names sound familiar, it's because we've already encountered them in Quash's will. So as you can see, all of the benevolent friends that Quash named as heirs in his will were in fact daughters of Samuel Winchell, his enslaver. It's just that in his will, they use their married names. And keep all of that in mind as we move forward with Quash's story. Now, I've not been able to ascertain yet how Quash came to Maine or who sold him to Samuel Winchell. In 18th century Maine, it wasn't difficult for a person of some means or access to credit to purchase an enslaved Black person. Merchants who traded in the West Indies regularly brought enslaved people from the sugar plantations there to sell in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and in Maine. In the left-hand advertisement on this page here, from the New Hampshire Gazette in 1758, you can see kidnapped African children for sale who could be bought right off the ship that carried them to Portsmouth. And in the right-hand advertisement from the same newspaper, the New Hampshire Gazette, in 1762, we learned that it was possible to purchase a human being in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, either with cash or, quote, good merchantable boards, that is, lumber. However he got to Maine, the earliest documented proof I found of Quash in Topsham is in 1763, when he features in a very dramatic set of events. Now, everything I'm about to tell you comes from the court records of Lincoln County, Maine, and the Superior Court records of Maine, which are held in Massachusetts, but both sets of records are free to access online at familysearch.org. On November 9th, 1762, so the court records tell us, Samuel Winchell and his neighbor, Samuel Staple, went to collect hay. While bringing it back, 3 tons of it was lost. And how this happened is not specified in the court records. Later in the same day, we are told, Hugh Wilson, a cabinet maker, also from Topsham, found the lost hay, and despite knowing it was not his to take, he hauled it home. 1 month later, on December 10th, Hugh Wilson sold that hay. And this is where things get interesting, because somehow word got back to Samuel Winchell that Hugh Wilson not only found their lost hay, but he took it home and he sold it. On January 4th, 1763, just a few weeks later, and infuriated, Winchell confronted Hugh Wilson in public, saying, quote, "You are a damned thief, and I can prove it. You are a known public thief." The following day, January 5th, 1763, as Hugh Wilson was still reeling from Winchell's insult, two men allegedly arrived at his farm and began loading up and hauling away 5 tons of Hugh's hay. Hugh identified these two men as Stephen Staple, brother to Samuel Staple, and Quash. They had apparently been sent by Samuel Winchell and Samuel Staple to settle the score with Hugh. And we know all of this because Stephen Staple and Quash were summoned to appear at the Court of General Sessions at Pownborough in September 1763 to answer to a charge of theft brought on by Hugh Wilson. Now, having been accused of stealing put Quash in an incredibly dangerous position. The New England courts dealt particularly harshly with Black people, especially enslaved Black people. Punishment was swift and it was harsh. And so this accusation brought Quash right into one of the places we in Lincoln County know so well, the historic Pownborough Courthouse, which you can still visit today in Dresden. When it was built in 1761, the courthouse was particularly tricky to access by land. It was hard for horses, nearly impossible for carriages. John Adams traveled to the Pownborough Courthouse as a young lawyer in 1765 and recorded his thoughts on the journey. And I have them here for you to read. They're very dramatic. It begins with, "It is unnecessary to enlarge upon the fatigue and disgust of this journey. In general, it was a wilderness, encumbered with the greatest number of trees of the largest size, the tallest height I have ever seen." And it goes on from there. It was a tricky journey. Now, Quash and Stephen Staple, however, would almost certainly have taken the easier way to Pownborough by boat, north up the Kennebec River. Their first clear view of the huge, imposing 3-story courthouse that September day, as they climbed the incline from the river landing, must have filled them with a mix of anxiety and awe. If Quash and Stephen Staple arrived the day before their court appearance, they may have taken food and drink in Samuel Goodwin's modest tavern on the first floor of the courthouse. When night fell, they may have hunkered down, bedless, on the 3rd floor in an area reserved for those attending court, or sat up all night by the fire if nerves kept them from sleep. Either way, it seems safe to say Quash wouldn't have felt very rested at all when the morning of his court appearance came. And it's easy to imagine the dread Quash must have experienced as he stepped into the 2nd floor courtroom on the 27th of September, 1763, not knowing what fate awaited him. Here is the sight that would have greeted Quash and Stephen Staple. 3 dour, bewigged, and black-robed justices unsmiling against a bank of bright windows. And on either side of the courtroom, a gallery full to bursting with observers, all eyes on them, necks craning, benches creaking as the gawking public jostled for a better look at the accused. And here is the record of that court appearance. Note that Quash's name is misspelled as Squash, and he is referred to as a servant, although in truth, he was enslaved. In the end, Quash and Stephen Staple were both released by the court and were permitted to make their way back down the Kennebec River towards Topsham. But this incident, entirely brought about by Samuel Winchell's feud with a neighbor, demonstrates how impulsive a man Samuel Winchell was and how angry he could become. His impulsiveness and inability to control his anger nearly had catastrophic consequences for Quash. And consider this. What must it have been like to have been enslaved by such a man? The 1760s were a chaotic time for the Winchell family. While the lumber business boomed and the family grew wealthier, cracks were beginning to show at the personal level. There was the court battle with Hugh Wilson that I just mentioned, which actually went on for several years. Then in June 1767, Winchell's daughter Martha was accused of the crime of fornication, and she was summoned to appear in court at Pownallborough. Her father, Samuel, attended court at the Pownallborough courthouse on her behalf and paid the prescribed fine before her case was even heard, sparing her and the family a humiliating trial. Not long after, in 1769, newly married Winchell's son, John, who had a habit of purchasing imported finery and large quantities of alcohol on credit and not repaying what was due, was taken all the way to the Superior Court by Brunswick merchant Benjamin Stone in an embarrassing debt trial. Debt would haunt him for the entirety of his adult life. Now, it's hard to say exactly how much Quash knew about these issues within the Winchell family. Quash would have worked closely with the Winchells at their sawmill, as well as on the Winchell farm and land. Quash may have had some access to the Winchell house, and so may have been privy to private talk between family members in shared spaces. However, it's made clear in documents that Quash was very much viewed as other by some of the Winchells, residing and working close at hand, but not part of the family. Tax records from Topsham held at the Pejepscot History Center in Brunswick speak to this othering of Quash. John Winchell, debt-ridden son of Samuel, was one of the men in charge of carrying out the tax valuation for the town in 1774. He had very distinctive handwriting, and I believe these three valuation documents were all written by him. And in these three records, Quash is referred to as, quote, Negro, Samuel Winchell's Negro, and finally as just Winchell's Negro, alongside other taxable property like ships and livestock. Quash, whom John Winchell had known personally for more than a decade by this time, was reduced to a piece of nameless taxable property by John's notations. However, Quash appears to have had the last word in this relationship. As you will recall, John was pointedly left out of Quash's will in favor of his 5 sisters. By the late 1770s, New England was deep in the throes of the American Revolution, and the Massachusetts District of Maine was suffering economic hardship because of it. With British ships haunting the coastal waters, lumber exports fell, mills grew silent, and imported food and supplies began to dry up. Massachusetts required muster quotas from Maine counties, removing able-bodied men from their fields, mills, and workshops. We can see the labor shortages of 1779 begin to play out in Quash's life directly in another remarkable surviving document, held today in the Lincoln County Probate Court and available to view online, again, at familysearch.org. So after Quash died, the probate court ordered that an inventory be taken of his possessions, which was a common practice. This inventory of Quash's possessions still exists, and it can be found in the same Lincoln County probate records that contain his will. And as Quash mentioned in his will, among his possessions were several notes of hand. Now, these were written agreements to furnish payment on request for services rendered, for example, for labor. So if you did some labor for a neighbor and they didn't have the cash to pay you, they would write you out a note of hand, which was essentially kind of a cross between an IOU and a personal check for the amount that your labor was worth. Now, Quash's inventory shows 6 notes of hand for 1779, when labor in Lincoln County was in short supply because of the Revolution. According to the notes of hand, Quash appears to have worked for several neighbors in Topsham in 1779, largely during the critical spring planting season, which you can see on the right-hand side. We see the familiar names of Samuel and Stephen Staple again. Now, the name Anthony Griffin stands out, however. He was not from Topsham, and his inclusion in these notes of hand gives us a glimpse into Quash's connections beyond the small community on the Cathants River. Anthony Griffin was a free Black man who had moved to the District of Maine with his family from Scituate, Massachusetts. In 1778, Now a widower, he married Jane Freeman, herself a widow with grown children. Over the course of the next century and beyond, this free Black family would grow and thrive in East Brunswick, just a short paddle across the Androscoggin River from Topsham. And in February 1779, when Quash worked for Anthony Griffin, he might have even been able to walk across to Brunswick on the ice. What must it have been like for Quash to spend time working alongside a free Black family away from the Winchells? Like him, several members of the Griffin-Freeman family had been enslaved and would have been able to empathize with and validate Quash's own experiences. Perhaps Quash counted them among his friends, sharing laughter and trading stories with them while they labored together. We know the Griffins maintained a connection with Quash because 6 years later, Jane Griffin's adult son, Peter Freeman, also hired Quash to work for him. Now, by 1781, it's clear from the Topsham tax records that Quash's status in the Winchell household had changed. Massachusetts required all free males above 16 years of age to be assessed a poll or head tax. In May 1781, the Topsham tax valuation shows Samuel Winchell was responsible for paying the poll tax for 2 free males over the age of 16 in his household. And since Samuel's son John is listed in the same record as the head of his own household, and the Winchells had no other surviving sons, it seems likely this second free male was Quash. So Quash was a free man, yet still living in the household of Samuel Winchell in May 1781, and Winchell was still responsible for paying Quash's poll tax. In a second valuation, dated November 1781, just 6 months later, a remarkable change can be seen. Samuel Winchell reported only 1 poll in his household, himself, and down at the very bottom of the page, we find Quash on his own, listed by name, assessed at 1 poll. He was no longer tied to the Winchell household except by surname. But what happened in the 6 months between May and November to precipitate this change? And the answer, I believe, I found in the Topsham town records. Samuel Winchell approached the town in 1781, asking to be cleared of his tax responsibility for the year. In July, the town refused his request. So perhaps Winchell took it upon himself to lighten his tax burden by removing Quash from his household. And at face value, this seems to be good news for Quash. However, a closer look at the entire tax record from November 1781 shows how Samuel Winchell's decision might have affected Quash negatively. And there's Quash all the way down at the bottom of this tax record. And if you follow the line of the database along the bottom there from Quash's name, you can see a lot of empty space. You don't see the numbers that are above marking off numbers of oxen or cows, amounts of acreage for grain. Quash, there's a lot of blank space next to his name. So according to the records, Quash had no land, no crops, no livestock, and being November, it was nearly winter. It's unclear where he was living. Still, he was expected to produce his tax payment for the year, and how he managed to fulfill this obligation is not known. Now, from a different set of Topsham tax valuation records, we learn that another free Black family, headed by a man named Philip Wilson of Brunswick, had settled in Topsham by November 1781, between the Cadance and Androscoggin rivers. Philip's wife was Jane Freeman II, so stepdaughter of Anthony Griffin, for whom you will recall Quash worked in 1779. And you can see on this map the close proximity of the Wilson, Freeman, and Griffin families on the map, as well as their proximity to the Winchell homestead. So all of these Black families living very close to each other within walking distance in Topsham and Brunswick. And here is that tax record. I'm just going to underline Philip Wilson's name down there at the bottom. Now, perhaps Philip and Jane Wilson offered hospitality and companionship to Quash during that long winter of 1782, as Quash began to make his way on his own. Perhaps the connections established between the Wilsons, the Griffins, the Freemans, and Quash meant that during that winter and beyond, Quash was lifted up and supported by the local Black community. And although that first winter was almost certainly difficult for Quash, perhaps it was also filled with the joy that comes from the warm fellowship of friends. In 1783, we find Quash in the Topsham tax records. Again, you're going to have to take my word for it because it is real faint. It's down at the bottom. And it's misspelled as squash. But we see he's gained some access to land. He is recorded as having livestock. He's got 1 cow, 7 sheep, as well as the ability to produce 20 bushels of corn or grain a year, an impressive increase in his fortunes over the course of 2 years. It's difficult to say for certain where in Topsham Quash might have been living, keeping his animals and cultivating land after leaving the Winchell household. Samuel Winchell died in March 1783, and this valuation from the same year shows Sarah Winchell, his widow, living on her own without her husband, with over 80 acres of land to work, and a full complement of livestock in need of care, including 5 cows, 4 oxen, and 17 sheep. This obviously was an impossible amount of work for an elderly widow to tackle alone. 3 of Sarah's daughters, Silence, Anne, and Hannah, were almost certainly living with her at this time. Remember that these daughters were named as Quash's heirs in his will, and they were called in his will his benevolent friends. Now, perhaps they encouraged their mother to take Quash on as a tenant to help maintain this large farm. And furthermore, an intriguing note of hand to Quash from the perpetually indebted John Winchell in 1784, which is just a year after his father died, for more than £7, which was a lot of money, further proves that even though the late Samuel Winchell may have cast Quash off with few resources, the surviving Winchell family members found they were still very much in need of him. And incidentally, this may also explain, in part, why John Winchell was excluded from Quash's will. John already owed Quash a great deal of money, £7, and Quash clearly did not expect that John would ever manage to pay him back, given John's terrible track record with debt. More notes of hand from the years 1785 to 1787 show Quash at work near where he had lived for more than 2 decades, between the Cathants and Androscoggin rivers. In May 1785, Quash went to work for Topsham newcomer Peter Freeman. And there he is, stepson to Anthony Griffin and brother-in-law to Philip Wilson. Freeman, a free Black cordwainer or shoemaker, had only recently arrived in Topsham from Ipswich, Massachusetts. He and his brother had sold the family's land there in 1784 and moved north to reunite with their mother, Jane, who was now married to Anthony Griffin. It seems reasonable to assume that Peter Freeman hired Quash on the recommendation of his family members, a decision that would have continued to strengthen the social connections between the Freemans, Griffins, Wilsons, and Quash. Now, there are no remaining church records or town records that record Quash's death in 1788. His inventory was presented to the probate court on June 26th. Martha Ballard in Hallowell records that it was a showery day. We learn more about Quash from this document of death, his probate inventory, than we do from any document created during his life. We've already seen how the notes of hand in Quash's inventory documented his working and personal relationships with other community members, both Black and white. In this last section of his probate inventory, we are afforded a more intimate look at his life as we read through the list of his possessions. And as you can see on the right-hand side, I have transcribed the possessions that are listed in his inventory, and I've preserved the creative spelling. Now here, are the possessions of a man who owns livestock and earns a living from raising them. The horse, saddle, and bridle allowed Quash the mobility to herd his flock of sheep from one grazing area to another, and the gun helped protect them from predators, including wolves, of which there were several in the Topsham, Brunswick area. Quash's horse would have significantly increased the ease by which he could tend his flock. Quash was also keeping stores of agricultural products in or near his living quarters. Corn is listed there, and 16 pounds of wool, which doesn't seem a lot until you actually pick up 16 pounds and think of how light a little fluff of wool is. So 16 pounds of wool, that was a lot of wool. These products may have been used by Quash to barter for goods with his neighbors or to purchase needed items from local merchants. Quash owned a feather bed and bedding to go with it, like linens and blankets. Feather beds in the 18th century were unlike our light, fluffy feather beds of today. Quash's feather bed would have been very heavy and densely packed with feathers, and it would have been warm in the wintertime. Though Quash's clothes are described as old, they were apparently worth a significant amount of money, which was 5 pounds. We can venture a guess as to what kinds of clothes Quash wore by turning our attention to several other items in Quash's inventory. And to help me illustrate this, I've cut out this 18th century painting of a young Black man, and it comes from a larger English painting by an unknown artist of an unknown white aristocrat hunting with his quote unquote servant, which is probably shorthand for slave. Though Quash's clothes were almost certainly not of this particular quality, some items of 18th century clothing were fairly universal to all classes. So this picture will help us understand what Quash had in his inventory. Now, the silver buckles, the pair of silver buckles noted in the inventory were most likely shoe buckles and would have been used for cinching the leather strap of the shoe tight across the top of Quash's foot. That they are silver and not some other base metal is very interesting. The pair of stone sleeve buttons would have been very much like modern cufflinks. They functioned very much like those, holding the open sides of Quash's shirt sleeves closed. Perhaps the stone would have been some sort of inset paste gem, and that was very popular at the time. The pair of silver knee buckles would have secured the hem of Quash's breeches underneath his knee. Again, it's interesting that they were made from silver. So from these 3 items, we're able to surmise that Quash may have worn shoes with buckles, a long sleeve shirt that required fastening at the wrists, and breeches that came to the knee. Other precious items stand out in Quash's inventory as well. Here we see a silver brooch, perhaps used to hold a cloak closed, 2 gold rings, they might have been earrings, and possibly a pearl, or peril, as it seems to have been written. Were these beloved keepsakes never to be used? Were they gifts from the Winchell daughters? Were they treasures from someone else altogether, someone whose connection to Quash has been lost to time? Or did Quash enjoy wearing these fine adornments and delight in acquiring them when his finances allowed? These handsome goods would have been a bold, conspicuous statement of Quash's own self-worth. By owning them and wearing them, Quash proclaimed, "I am a person worthy of beautiful things," thereby restoring his agency over an existence that once sought to rob him of all trace of personhood. Like the act of writing his will, owning these fine adornments was an act of freedom, of independence, and of pride. Now, when the entire value of Quash's estate was tallied, it was worth somewhere around 83 pounds, taking into account the depreciation of continental paper currency. Now, I'm not an economic historian, and truthfully, I've relied on inflation and currency converters on the internet to arrive at my next numbers, and so they may be really flawed. But from my imperfect calculations, Quash's estate may have been worth the equivalent of $10,000 today, which is an extraordinary legacy for a man who owned neither land nor livestock 7 years before and who had once been the property of another person. Quash was the absolute epitome of a self-made man in the 18th century, or really, any century. But today, it's hard to find evidence of Quash's life on the landscape of Topsham. Because he requested in his will to be decently buried, it seems likely that he rests somewhere in the First Parish Cemetery in Topsham, where Samuel and Sarah Winchell and many of their children lie, but I have not found any record of his grave. It's possible to visit the site of the former Cadence sawmill and even enjoy a picnic there at the head of Tide Park on Cadence Road in Topsham, while looking up towards the former site of the Winchell's homestead. There's impressive interpretive signage at the park with an image of an 18th century map that shows the Winchell's property beside the Cadence sawmill. But there is no mention of Quash, none at all. Whether by conscious action or malign indifference, over time, Quash's remarkable story has been hidden, as have the stories of hundreds of other enslaved and free Black Mainers. But it does not have to stay this way. We can all become citizen historians and use local records to seek out silenced voices in our communities and amplify them once again. I encourage you to become curious about your communities in Lincoln County and the history that's been hidden in them and hidden from them. Help to uncover these stories. This is necessary work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I've been sitting here taking notes even. Let's see, did you stop sharing your screen? I think you did.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. That was fascinating. And I loved how you wrote, you encouraged everyone to become citizen historians, amplifying silenced voices. That's something I'm going to remember. I see some clapping in the chat, and there have been a few questions.
Great.
Actually, quite a few coming in. Let's start with this one from board